On September 15th, the United Nations Human Rights Council issued a scathing report against Israel regarding its conduct in the Gaza war. The report describes the destruction of infrastructures and the wanton killing of civilians. The report also makes room for a recommendation to investigate charges of war crimes. Israel, in response, says that it has developed new ways and essential ways of waging asymmetric war against guerrillas. Who's right? War crimes or new ways of waging war? Well, the fact of the matter is they're both right. And to understand this, we have to look at the casualties, the people who were killed during the Gaza war. Roughly 1,200 people died during the war. 1,200 Palestinians died during the war. It breaks down into roughly 4 groups. 300 militants, 300 civilians who supported the war, 300 police, and 300 civilians who are innocent and who took no part in the fighting. Of the 300 militants, there's no debate. These were combatants, these were vulnerable targets, and none of the sides take issue with Israel's conduct in that regard. Problems begin to arise when we look at 300 police who died during the war. The UN Commission, as well as international law, places police officers in the category of civilians. They're protected. They're protected from harm and they can't be killed during war. Israel, on the other hand, comes along and says, these aren't really policemen. This is nothing but a paramilitary force that fights alongside Hamas when conditions necessitate it. The United Nations found no evidence in the report to support this, and Israel, unfortunately, refused to cooperate with the United Nations Commission, and therefore the charge stands. Until Israel can come along and prove that these policemen were active members of Hamas or intended to take part in the war or took part in the war, then there's no reason to suppose that they were vulnerable to harm. Again, Israel must come along and provide the information needed to make this assessment. What about the civilians who support the war, particularly the political wing of Hamas? Well, under international law and according to the UN, these are also civilians. They're also protected. They cannot be made targets of an attack. Well, the Israeli position is a little bit different. Since the Lebanon war, those who support the war, civilians, which were many, many people, supported the war in many different ways, were considered to be targets. These were people who raised money. These were people who provided logistical support. These were people who, in some cases, worked for educational, welfare, or financial institutions of the guerrilla organization. These were people who supported the war in a very active way, and just as importantly, the guerrilla organization, like Hezbollah, or in this case Hamas, could not wage war without their help. And the position of Israel, as a stronger state army, as it fights a guerrilla organization, is that these civilians are vulnerable targets. And my assessment would be this is correct. In other words, this is a changing norm of war. This is a new way that we should look at war. We should look at these civilians, those who contribute to the war in an appreciable way, as vulnerable targets. However, there are 2 caveats. One is that although Israel has the right to disable these targets, they do not necessarily have the right to kill them. In other words, a state army attacking what we call civilian combatants has to think about ways of developing non-lethal weaponry and ways to disable these people by arresting them, incarcerating them, perhaps even expelling them as a way to disable them and the functions they provide. And secondly, Israel has to provide a list. They have to say who among the 1,200 casualties was a civilian combatant. What did they do? Now we know, Israel knows, the Palestinians know, and the United Nations know the names of most of the 1,200 people who died. The controversy centers around what they did during the war. But again, if Israel doesn't participate, doesn't cooperate with the UN Commission, it's impossible to know who did what, and therefore it's impossible for Israel to substantiate its claim. The hardest question, though, revolves around the roughly 300 civilians who died who were innocent, who did not take part in the fighting. Now, some of these civilians died in the context of what's called collateral damage. A military raid was carried out and civilians died. This is permissible in war as long as too many civilians don't die. This is called proportionate harm. In other words, civilians can suffer harm, they can be killed as long as the number is not disproportionate. Well, what happened in Gaza? What is the number, and was this number disproportionate? The answer is it's hard to tell, because the claim of the Israelis, and I think rightly so, is that Hamas fights without uniforms, civilians are close to the fighting, and therefore more are likely to get killed in a conventional war where an army can move out into the field. Now, this may raise the number of allowable casualties, but it does not allow Israel to take lives intentionally. And this is at the center of the report. The report claims that Israel developed a deliberate policy of disproportionate harm. This became known as the Dahiyya policy, named after a neighborhood in Beirut that was flattened during the Second Lebanon War. And it signifies the use of disproportionate force, intentional disproportionate force, to demoralize civilians, to convince their leaders to stop fighting, and to act as a deterrent against fighting in future wars. It deliberately targets civilians for this purpose, and it's forbidden. It makes a mockery of non-combatant immunity, and here Israel has to step back. Here the government of Israel has to come along and say, yes, there's room to think about attacking police. Yes, there's room to think about attacking civilian combatants, but there is no room to deliberately attacking innocent civilians to further one's war aims any more than there's room to use nuclear weapons or biological weapons or chemical weapons. I think this is the lesson that has to be learned. And in answer to the question then, were war crimes committed? Did Israel violate the Geneva Conventions? Or are there new norms of war that are being developed by Israel? The answer is all three. Yes, there's room to investigate war crimes. Yes, there's room to look for violations of the Geneva Conventions. But yes, there's a challenge and a need to look at the way asymmetric wars are run to allow room for fighting against certain classes of civilians, certain classes of police officers, and thinking hard about the concept of disproportionate harm and proportionate harm and where the line that we have to draw belongs. Thank you.